Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we are going to be talking all about Simplecast. It's a pretty popular platform for getting your podcast out there, hosting it and all that and distributing it. But we're not stopping there. Oh, no. You want to know how to really make it work? How to hustle with your podcast, right? So you sent us a bunch of articles and notes about growing your audience and getting people engaged and maybe even, making some money.
Yeah, for sure. We'll definitely take a look at what Simplecast can do, all the features and all, but also some of the bigger picture stuff, the strategies that work no matter where you host. Think of it like a master class,
Yeah.
to help you level up your podcast game, specifically for your idea about a podcast on the history of board games.
Now, you mentioned you're thinking about starting a podcast about the history of board games, and you seem particularly interested in strategy games. That's a great niche. I mean, it's always a good idea to, focus on a specific area, especially something you're really passionate about. It's like choosing a cozy little corner in a giant bustling library. You're curating an experience, for people who share your interests.
Right. And speaking of curating, let's talk about where Simplecast fits into all of this. It's a powerful tool, there's no doubt, but it's important to understand what it does and what it doesn't do. You could think of it kind of like the engine of your podcast car, I guess.
Yeah.
It gets your content out there reliably and efficiently, but you still need to build the actual car, the recording, editing, the whole thing.
Okay, I like that, the car analogy. So
Okay.
Simplecast isn't where you actually record or edit your episodes. Makes sense. But once they're all ready to go, that's where Simplecast takes over, right? It handles all the distribution, makes sure your podcast lands on all the major platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the big names.
Exactly. And no matter how big your audience gets, Simplecast can grow with you. That peace of mind is so valuable because it lets you focus on what really matters, creating amazing content. Because, as they say, content is king. But you know what? In the world of podcasting, strategy is queen.
Now, this is where things get interesting. You sent us some notes about really niching down, specifically focusing on the history of strategy board games. So tell me more about why you chose that. What unique perspective are you bringing to the table?
Niching down, it's definitely smart, but it's only the first step, right? The real question is, what will make your podcast stand out? What makes it unique? Maybe you have a collection of rare game manuals, or you'll interview game designers and historians, things like that. Think about that unique value you're offering to listeners.
I love that. You're not just recounting history. You're adding your own spin to it.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of adding a personal touch, you mentioned listener feedback being important. How are you thinking of incorporating that into your podcast?
That's a fantastic idea. Listener feedback is so valuable, Maybe you could do a whole episode where you answer listener questions or even let them vote on topics for future episodes. Building that interactive element can really foster a sense of community around your podcast.
And a strong community. That is gold for any podcaster.
Yeah.
You know what else is super valuable? Data. Which brings us to Simplecast's analytics dashboard. It tracks all sorts of data, who's listening, where they're listening from, even which parts of your episodes are the most popular.
That's right. It's like you've got this backstage pass, right, to your listeners' listening habits. You can see which episodes are really hitting the mark, where people are maybe tuning out, and use all that information to make your podcast even better. Like if you notice a big spike in downloads when you mention a particular game, maybe that's a sign to do a whole episode on that.
It's like having a conversation with your audience even after you've hit publish.
Exactly. Now, let's be real. Let's talk about turning your passion into some, profit. You sent over some research on monetization, and it's clear you've given this some thought.
So let's be honest, who doesn't like the idea of making money from something they love, right?
Exactly. And you've got options. Sponsorships, listener support through platforms like Patreon, even selling your own, board game related merch or even courses. But before we dive into all that, remember the golden rule. First, you build a dedicated audience, then you monetize it.
It's like building a house, right? You got to have a solid foundation before you start decorating. So let's focus on laying those preps. Now, you were interested in Simplecast's dynamic ad insertion. Tell me more about that.
Oh, yeah. Dynamic ad insertion. Well, at Simplecast's fancy way of saying you can insert ads into your episodes, even after they're published. It's a game changer, especially if you're thinking about sponsorships. You can just seamlessly add pre-roll, mid-roll, or post-roll ads. Gives you so much more flexibility and control over your monetization.
That sounds really cool, like a secret weapon for your podcast.
Exactly. But, you mentioned you don't want to bombard listeners with ads, and that's smart. Finding that balance between monetization and listener experience, that's key. It's a dance, not a sprint.
And speaking of dancing, you mentioned wanting to learn more about Simplecast's pricing plans. They offer a few different options, starting small and scaling up as you grow. It's like picking the right shoe size. You don't want to go too big or too small right out of the gate.
Exactly. And as your podcast grows, you can easily upgrade to a plan that fits your needs. This flexibility is a big reason why Simplecast is so popular, especially among independent podcasters like you. It really is all about finding that right fit. Okay, so you mentioned in your notes that you're interested in checking out different ways to make money besides just ads. Let's dig into that a little. You specifically mentioned Patreon. What are your thoughts on using something like that for your board game podcast?
Yeah, Patreon's a cool way to build a community, and to get that direct support from your most loyal fans, the ones who really love what you're doing. You can offer all sorts of bonus content, like early access to episodes or maybe behind-the-scenes glimpses of how you make the podcast. But I'm curious, for a podcast all about board game history, what kind of exclusive content do you think would really work for those listeners?
That's where knowing your audience is so, so key. Maybe you offer those extended interviews with game designers or like really deep dives into specific game mechanics, the nitty-gritty. You could even host live Q&A sessions or even game nights exclusively for your Patreon supporters.
I love that. It's like creating this virtual board game club where everyone can just geek out together. And speaking of geeking out, let's talk about how to actually get those listeners in the first place. We know Simplecast does the heavy lifting, getting your podcast onto the major platforms. But what about all those other ways to promote it? There's got to be more, right?
That's where the hustle comes in, my friend. And it all starts with understanding your audience, figuring out where they hang out online. Where do board game enthusiasts gather? Reddit, Facebook groups, specific forums maybe. You got to meet them where they are.
Like finding the right watering hole, right? Okay, so social media is obviously a big one. But it can be kind of overwhelming, so many platforms, so much noise. Any tips on how to make the most of it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. First things first, think about which platforms really make sense for your content and for your target audience.
Yeah.
For a board game podcast, visually driven platforms like Instagram or YouTube, those might be great, for showcasing all those beautiful game boards and components.
Right. A picture is worth 1,000 words, especially when it comes to board games. You could do like eye-catching graphics with quotes from your episodes or maybe even time-lapse videos of, setting up a game.
Exactly. And don't forget about those short-form video platforms like TikTok. Those are huge. Imagine making like quick videos about interesting board game facts or reviews of games, even funny skits. Keep it light.
Okay, I'm already picturing a hilarious TikTok about the history of Monopoly, but what about those platforms that are less visual and more about, text and discussion? Like, what about those?
Oh, those are still valuable. Don't discount them. Platforms like Twitter and Facebook, they can be awesome for starting conversations, engaging with your audience, getting them talking. Think about posting like thought-provoking questions related to board game history or doing polls asking listeners about their favorite games.
Engaging with listeners is so key. It's that back and forth that makes podcasting feel so personal. But okay, beyond social media, what are some other ways to reach those potential board game history buffs?
Well, you mentioned making a website in your notes, and that's a fantastic idea. It's like, home base for your podcast. You can have super detailed show notes with links to resources, transcripts for accessibility. You could even have a blog where you go deeper on the topics from your episodes.
It's like creating a whole world around your podcast, and it gives you a place to send people from social media or other platforms.
Exactly. And speaking of sending people places, let's talk about email lists. I know they seem a bit old school these days, what with all the social media and all. But they're still incredibly powerful for building a direct connection with those listeners who are really dedicated,
Okay, I admit it. I kind of love email marketing. Tell me more. Tell me more.
Think of it like this, right? You're not at the mercy of those algorithms on social media. You know the ones. With an email list, you're in control. You can send regular newsletters with updates, behind-the-scenes stuff, even exclusive offers, all to your most engaged listeners.
Like a VIP lounge for your biggest fans. But how do you actually get people to sign up for this email list thing?
Offer them something valuable, something they want. Could be a free guide to like essential strategy board games or a checklist for starting a board game collection. Heck, even a bonus episode of the podcast.
It's like a welcome gift, right, for joining your little podcasting party. And speaking of parties, let's talk about cross-promotion. You mentioned wanting to collaborate with other podcasters.
That's a brilliant strategy to reach a whole new audience. Think about other podcasts that fit with your interests. Could be board games, history, pop culture, even business podcasts, especially if you're, looking at the business side of the board game industry.
Right. You could reach out to them, maybe be a guest on their show or have them as a guest on yours. You could cross-promote each other on social media. Heck, even do a giveaway together.
It's all about those win-win situations, right? Leveraging each other's audiences, growing together. But let's go back to your website for a sec. You said you were interested in learning more about SEO, right? It can sound a bit intimidating, but it's really just about making sure your website is easy for those search engines like Google to find.
So it's less about like secret codes and more about making your website user-friendly.
Exactly. It's about using those relevant keywords in your website. Copy, optimizing your page titles and descriptions and making sure your website is structured in a way that search engines can easily understand. It's like speaking Google's language.
Okay, so it's like giving Google a map of your website so it can easily send people to your awesome content. But beyond Google, what are some other ways to make sure people are actually finding your podcast on all the different apps and, directories out there?
This is where Simplecast really shines, Remember that one-click distribution thing we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah, that was pretty impressive.
Well, that lets you submit your podcast to all those big directories, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, the whole shebang, all with a single click. It's a huge time saver, and it makes sure your podcast is easy to find for a much bigger audience.
That is incredible. It's like having a personal assistant for podcast distribution. But even with all that reach, sometimes you need to give things a little extra push, right? You mentioned being curious about paid advertising.
Paid advertising can be a great way to get in front of new listeners, especially when you're just starting out. You could run targeted ads on social media, or even use platforms like Google Ads to put your podcast right in front of the people who are searching for, board game-related stuff.
That sounds pretty smart, especially when you're launching a new podcast and want to make a big splash. But I imagine it can get pretty expensive, can it?
It can, yeah. That's why it's important to, set a budget and then track your results really carefully. You want to make sure you're getting your money's worth. Simplecast's analytics can actually be really helpful here. They can show you exactly how many new listeners are coming from your ads.
So it's like a data-driven roadmap for your advertising. I like it. But even with the best promotion in the world, at the end of the day, it's the content that really matters, right? What advice would you give to someone just starting out, like our listener here, who wants to create a board game history podcast that people will actually want to listen to?
The first thing is to find your voice. Don't be afraid to let your personality come through. Are you witty? Academic? A storyteller? Let that come through in how you talk on the podcast.
Right, because nobody wants to listen to a podcast that sounds like a boring textbook, right? We want those juicy stories, those behind-the-scenes tidbits, the things that make history come alive.
Exactly. And think about your episode structure.
Yeah.
How you put things together. Would it make sense to have regular segments, maybe a game of the week where you deep dive into one specific game, or a history mystery, or you uncover some little-known fact about board game history, something like that?
Those are great ideas. And don't forget about the power of storytelling, like weaving narratives into your historical accounts. That can make them way more compelling, more memorable.
Absolutely. Imagine starting an episode with a gripping story about how a particular game was invented, or the impact it had on culture. It's like setting the stage for an epic board game adventure,
Okay, you've got me hooked. But storytelling aside, what about the more technical side of things? Any advice for someone who's totally new to audio editing and all that production stuff?
Don't get scared by the tech, There are so many free and affordable resources out there to help you. You said you were thinking about using GarageBand in your notes. That's a great starting point, super user-friendly, and surprisingly powerful for basic editing.
And if you ever need something more, with more advanced features, there are tons of options like Audacity, that one's free and open source, or Adobe Audition, that's more professional level, but really good.
Exactly. And, don't underestimate good audio quality.
Yeah.
Getting a decent microphone can make a huge difference in how professional your podcast sounds. It really can.
And you don't need to spend a fortune either. There are some awesome USB microphones out there that are perfect for beginners.
Right. Clarity is key. Make sure you're recording in a quiet spot and that your microphone's positioned right. You don't want your listeners struggling to hear you over background noise or anything like that.
It's all about making it easy and enjoyable to listen to your podcast, All right, before we move on to some of the more advanced stuff, I want to circle back to something you mentioned before about engaging with your listeners, really making that connection.
Engaging with listeners is so important, you know? It takes your podcast from being this one-way broadcast to like a real conversation. And it all starts with a simple call to action. At the end of each episode, tell your listeners exactly what you want them to do.
Do you want them to, like, leave a review, follow you on social media, join that email list we talked about? Don't be shy about asking. People are usually happy to support the podcast they love, but you got to tell them, give them clear instructions.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just those, specific calls to action. Respond to comments on social media, answer questions, even do those Q&A sessions where you're directly addressing what your listeners want to know.
It's all about building that relationship, and showing your listeners that you really value their input.
And remember, you mentioned in your notes that you're a bit introverted. Engaging with listeners doesn't have to mean being, super outgoing. Be yourself, even if that means being a little more reserved.
That's such an important point. Authenticity is key. People connect with that. If you're trying to be someone you're not, it'll show.
Yeah, exactly. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about some of those, more advanced strategies for taking your podcast to that next level. You mentioned being interested in creating a lead magnet to grow your email list. Let's brainstorm some ideas, stuff that would be especially tempting for your audience.
Okay, let's get creative here. Remember, a lead magnet is something valuable, something you give away for free, but in exchange for an email address, right?
For your board game history podcast, it could be something like a downloadable PDF, with a timeline of all the key moments in board game history. Or maybe a curated list of the best books on board game design.
Those are good ones. What about something interactive, like a quiz, where listeners can test their board game knowledge?
I love that idea. Or maybe a printable board game scorecard, something they can use for their own game nights. It's all about giving them something they'll actually use and enjoy.
And once you've got them on your email list, you can nurture that relationship, right?
Yeah.
Send regular newsletters with exclusive content, behind-the-scenes updates, maybe even special offers or discounts on board game stuff.
Exactly. It's all about building that loyal community, those board game enthusiasts who are, hanging on your every word.
And speaking of community, what about those really dedicated listeners, the ones who want to take it to that next level? We talked about Patreon, but what about other ways to create that deeper connection, offer a more premium experience?
Now we're talking. You could create a whole membership community, use platforms like Patreon, Mighty Networks, Circle. Those are all good options. Think of it like your inner circle of board game superfans.
Ooh, I like that, the inner circle. What kind of perks could you offer in something like that?
Sky's the limit. You could do live Q&A sessions, exclusive game nights, early access to your episodes, all sorts of behind-the-scenes content, even a private forum where members can chat and discuss board games.
It's like a digital clubhouse, just for board game enthusiasts. But beyond the digital world, what about connecting with your audience in person, like in real life?
You're thinking about events, aren't you?
Exactly. Now, you mentioned being a bit introverted, but even if you're not into those big conferences, there are other ways to connect with people who love board games.
Absolutely. Think about, local game stores, board game conventions, even libraries or community centers that have game nights. You could start by just going as a participant, networking with people, finding common ground.
And hey, who knows, maybe down the line you could even host your own event or workshop,
Exactly. And as you start to build a name for yourself in the board game community, you might even get invited to speak at events or conferences.
Speaking at events is an awesome way to build your credibility, reach new people, and promote your podcast all at once. And hey, you might even discover some cool new games you haven't seen before.
Totally. The board game world is full of passionate and creative people. Connecting with them in person can be so rewarding, both personally and professionally.
Now let's talk about something that can be both exciting and a little scary. Collaborations. We talked about cross-promotion with other podcasters, but what about working with, other creators in the board game space?
That is a fantastic way to expand your reach and tap into new audiences, for sure. Think about board game reviewers, designers, artists, even writers or historians who focus on games. Those are all possibilities.
Right? You could co-create content together, do interviews together. Heck, you could even develop a board game together.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless, especially when you start thinking about collaborations. It's about finding those partnerships where you can each bring your strengths to the table and create something really special,
Collaboration is like adding an extra player to your podcasting game. It brings in new strategies, new perspective, and can even lead to unexpected wins. But beyond collaborations, what about things you can do on your own? You mentioned wanting to create your own, board game related products.
That's a fantastic goal.
Yeah.
And it fits perfectly with your passion for board games and all your knowledge about their history. What kind of products do you have in mind?
Well, earlier you mentioned merch, like, t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, all with your podcast logo or maybe some fun catchphrases. That stuff's great for getting your name out there and giving your listeners a way to show their support.
For sure. And think about educational products too, like online courses.
Yeah.
You can teach people about board game design, history, even strategy.
Or what about a curated box of, like, vintage board games or replicas of historical games?
Those are amazing ideas. You're really tapping into what makes you special, both as a board game enthusiast and as a podcast host.
And those products, they can bring in some revenue, of course, but they also deepen the connection with your audience. Give them something they can actually hold in their hands.
Exactly. It's all about creating a whole experience around your podcast, something that goes way beyond just listening to the episodes.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from like picking your niche and monetization to social media and even creating your own products. It's a lot of process, but I want to really emphasize this one thing. Build a strong foundation first. That's the key.
I couldn't agree more. It's easy to jump into all the fancy stuff, but the most important thing is to have a podcast that people actually want to listen to, right?
Right. Focus on giving people something valuable, telling good stories, and building a community around your shared love for board game history. All the other stuff will fall into place after that.
And remember, you mentioned feeling a bit overwhelmed by the tech side of podcasting. Don't let that stop you.
Exactly. Start small, experiment, and learn as you go. There's a ton of help out there, and the podcasting community is super supportive. They really want to see you succeed.
Right. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Right.
There are mentors, coaches, online communities, all filled with experienced podcasters who are happy to help.
And hey, don't forget, we're always here for you too, to help guide you on your podcasting journey. So as we move into the last part of our deep dive here, I want to leave you with this thought. What's one little step, even a tiny one, that you can take today to move your podcast idea forward? Maybe it's just like jotting down some episode ideas or looking into potential guests. Heck, even sketching out a logo, just something small. Every journey starts with a single step, right?
That's so true. Even just writing one sentence for your podcast description, that's a step. And while you're taking those steps, remember, Simplecast has your back. They'll be there to support you all the way.
Speaking of Simplecast, we've talked a lot about what it does, the features and all, but I'm kind of curious from like a techie standpoint, what makes Simplecast stand out, compared to other hosting platforms?
One of the big things is reliability. Simplecast is known for being rock solid, almost no downtime. They use a content delivery network, a CDN, which basically means your audio files are on like multiple servers all over the world.
So even if one server crashes, your podcast is still up and running.
Exactly. And they have this really intuitive analytics dashboard. It's great. Gives you a clear picture of how your podcast is doing. You can see downloads, listener demographics, even where people are listening from.
Data is power, especially for podcasters. But what about like how easy it is to use? You mentioned Simplecast being good for beginners.
Oh, absolutely. It's got a really clean, user-friendly interface, makes it super easy to upload your episodes, manage your settings, and track all that analytic stuff. Even if you're not a tech whiz, you'll be fine.
That's good to know. And speaking of easy, they have that one-click distribution thing we talked about, right? Super simple to get your podcast on all the major directories.
Exactly. Plus, their customer support is awesome, so if you ever get stuck, they're there to help you out.
That peace of mind is worth a lot, especially when you're first starting out and maybe feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the technical stuff.
Oh, for sure. Speaking of overwhelm, let's talk about something people don't always think about, but it's so important. Organization and workflow.
Okay, yeah, this is something I struggle with, definitely. I'm not the most organized person, especially when it comes to projects.
Hey, you're not alone. It's easy to get caught up in the creative side of things, right?
Right.
But having a structured workflow, it can save you so much time and stress down the line.
So where do we even begin?
First thing, think about your recording setup, Do you have a dedicated space to record somewhere that's quiet, no distractions? Have you got a decent microphone, headphones, all that?
Yeah, those are essential. You want your audio quality to be good, clear and professional.
Exactly. Okay, once you've got your recording setup figured out, think about your editing process. What software are you comfortable using? Have you got a system for organizing your audio files and all your project folders?
Oh, yeah. A system is key. I've definitely lost track of files before. Not a fun experience.
Right. And once you've nailed down the recording and editing, think about your publishing schedule. Consistency is super important when it comes to podcasting.
So it's better to have a regular schedule, like even if it's just once a month, than to release episodes randomly.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Listeners like knowing when to expect new episodes, and it helps you stay on track and motivated.
Okay, so we've got the recording, editing, and publishing figured out. What about all the other stuff like social media, email, marketing, website stuff, all that?
Those are all important too, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the different things you got to do. That's where tools can help, like project management software, or even just a simple spreadsheet.
So we could make a checklist, right, of all the tasks that need to be done each week or each month.
Exactly. And you can block out time in your calendar specifically for those podcasting tasks.
Mm.
Helps you stay organized and keeps it from taking over your life.
That's a good tip. I'm totally guilty of letting work creep into my evenings and weekends.
Setting boundaries is so important,
Mm.
especially if you're passionate about podcasting and tend to go all in. Self-care is crucial. Remember that.
I love that phrase, creative sustainability. It's so true. If you burn yourself out, you won't be able to create anything good.
Exactly. Speaking of creating good stuff, let's talk about something that can really make your podcast sound amazing. Music and sound design.
Okay, this is something I've always wondered about. I know music can make a podcast so much better, but where do you find, like, royalty-free music? Stuff that's actually good quality and not super expensive.
Oh, there's some fantastic resources out there. You've got platforms like Epidemic Sound, Artlist, MusicBed. They all offer tons of royalty-free music and sound effects that you can use without worrying about, copyright issues.
That's awesome. I've always been a little nervous about using music, just didn't want to get in trouble.
I get it.
Oh.
But these platforms make it really easy and affordable to find the perfect music for your podcast. Think about using it for your intro and outro, maybe transitions between segments, or even just as background music for certain parts.
Music can really set the mood and make it more immersive for the listener. It's like adding a soundtrack to your podcast.
Exactly. And don't forget about sound effects. Even simple things like the sound of a page turning or a door creaking can add a touch of realism.
It's all those little touches, right, that make it come alive.
Right. Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, authenticity. It's something you can't fake. It has to come from you.
I love that. It's about being real, being true to your own voice, to your passions.
Exactly. Don't try to be someone you're not. Don't try to copy other podcasts or follow trends that don't feel right to you. Embrace what makes you unique and let that come through in your podcast.
Because at the end of the day, that's what people connect with, right? Realness, vulnerability, passion, that's what matters.
Right. And remember, podcasting, it's a journey, There will be ups and downs, moments of doubt, maybe even times when you want to quit.
But it's those challenges that make the victories even sweeter.
Absolutely. The most important thing is to enjoy it, to learn and grow along the way and never be afraid to try new things.
So as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Your podcast, it's a gift, It's a gift to yourself, to your listeners, to the world.
It's a way to share your voice, your passions, your stories, and it has the power to connect you with people in ways you never thought possible.
So go out there and create.
Yeah.
Share your gift and let your podcast be this beacon of, joy, inspiration, connection. That's what it's all about.